Hello everyone, this is Dave Corinth, and today I'm going to show you how I make my chip breaker screwdriver from old plane knobs. I have a pretty good assortment of plane knobs laying around my shop. Some are old, some are cracked, some are damaged, some are ones I made that didn't work out, but they work great for making the handle on a chip breaker screwdriver. So let's see why we need one. So why do you need a chip breaker screwdriver? Well, it's the best tool for the task. It has the correct size tip that's 5/8 of an inch wide, which is the exact same width as the screw that keeps the iron secured to the chip breaker. And it fits right in there. You could use a regular screwdriver, but as you can see, the tip of it is about half of what this is. And you definitely don't want to use this. It ends up chipping the end. The tips of these lever caps are hardened and they're very brittle. So over time, people would take these out and turn it with that, and it would end up chipping the end of the lever cap. So not the right tool, not the right tool, the right tool. I make these from old plane knobs. Now this one's a rosewood one, but it has check marks all along the base. And I could epoxy it and fix it, but it would be a great chip breaker screwdriver handle. This is an old hardwood one that was stained red and it's got paint splatters on it, and it's hardwood, so it's not that desirable. Here's one that's a short knob and or a low knob, and it's pretty chewed up. You can see all the marks on it, but it would make a great chip breaker screwdriver handle. Here's one that was made out of mahogany for a union plane that I made, and it has a bead on it, but it doesn't have the same right profile. So this one was discarded to use for that plane, but it would make a great chip breaker screwdriver handle. So we're going to make one of these today. I'm going to show you step by step how I did it, the materials used, and these are great little tools to have around the shop. So let's get started. First, I'm going to square the end of that brass fitting up, and then I'm going to turn the outside to remove that knurling, taking it down to 5/8 of an inch. Then I'm going to drill the center to 7/16 of an inch all the way through the fitting. Flip it over, square up the backside. I use O1 tool steel to make the bit. I have lots of scrap pieces laying around the shop. This piece, I'm squaring it up on both sides. I want these two sides to be parallel and 5/8 of an inch wide. I want the inner part or the step to be 7/16 of an inch wide. The inner step will slide inside the ferrule, and the 5/8 of an inch wide part will stick outside the ferrule and become the tip of the screwdriver. Perfect fit. I'm using a piece of red oak for the plug. I use this piece of oak because it's some scraps that I had laying around the shop. You could use almost any hardwood, or you could buy a 9/16 dowel, and that would save you the trouble having to turn down the base. The base is 9/16 of an inch wide because that's how large the hole is that Stanley drills for the boss on the underside of the knob. And they're drilled about 3/4 of an inch deep. The step is where the brass ferrule will slide over this, and it's turned down to 7/16. When I turn these, I turn it about 1/8 of an inch too long, but that'll get cut off later. I don't even sand because I'm not worried about that. It'll stick better with the epoxy. You want this to be a snug fit. Definitely don't want it too loose. I scratched my head for a little while figuring out how to make this slot go perfectly in the center. And I came up with this jig. It's just a piece of walnut with a 9/16 hole drilled down the center of it and a slot for a handsaw to cut the slot. I scribe where I want the slot to be cut, marking both sides of the curve. And then I take a rip saw, cut down that slot perfectly square to a predetermined mark that I put on the bottom of it. I then mark the center line and then drill right at that point with a 9/16 Forstner bit about 1 inch down. I then take a 1/8 inch drill bit and drill all the way through the block. This allows me to push the dowel through the other side once I'm done cutting that slot. And there you can see that hole that goes all the way through. I push the plug into the jig and then take my panel saw and cut that slot down the slot that I made in the jig. I stop when I get to a predetermined mark at the bottom. I then push the plug through from the underside with that hole I drilled. I then take a 1/16 inch wide file and clean that slot up. The panel saw doesn't cut it that wide, so this just makes it a little bit wider so that bit fits in there perfectly. Nice, snug fit. You can see that oak sticks out past the ferrule. So I mark it and I'm going to cut that out on the bandsaw. Okay. I have a gunned up section on my disc sander, and I purposely didn't clean it so I could burn the end of this plug. Next, I'm just going to take a piece of 220 grit sandpaper and lap the bit, removing some of those burrs. Also trims your fingernails while you're at it. I use a very strong 2-part marine epoxy to set the plug into the base. And then epoxy the step, making sure to get some epoxy in that slot. Then I slide the ferrule over that, and I turn it while I do this to ensure that I get complete coverage, and then slide the bit in, making sure it's seated well. I come in the next morning, start to sand the epoxy that oozed out the sides. This is a very tedious task, but it will make the chip breaker screwdriver look a lot better. And anywhere there's epoxy, it won't accept the stain. I then do the same thing to that brass ferrule, removing any epoxy that got on it. Near the base, I take this small file and clean the ferrule up because the sandpaper wouldn't get right up against where the brass ferrule and the mahogany meet. I put a piece of 220 grit sandpaper on a piece of Scotch-Brite. The Scotch-Brite is soft and it prevents me sanding a flat spot on the top of that knob. It lets that sandpaper contour to the shape of that knob a little bit better. When I'm done with that, I'll just take the same sandpaper and then go over the whole knob. I try to go with the grain when I can, but you can't always do that. Finally, I take some 4/0 steel wool and polish the whole thing up. This is my special stain that I kind of made to make mahogany look more like rosewood. It's a mix between red mahogany and special walnut. I'm not bashful with it here. I'll wipe it down once that stain's had its chance to set in there. I finish these with lacquer. Takes 3 or 4 light coats, sometimes more, sometimes less, but mahogany soaks that stuff in, so usually it takes 3 to 4. Once that's dried for about 2 or 3 hours, I make sure that if I touch it, it doesn't have any tacky feeling to it. Then I'll take 4/0 steel wool and begin the polishing process. No, my hands don't move that fast. I've got this sped up, so you don't have to watch me sit there with steel wool. Once I remove the tape off the brass ferrule, I'll buff the whole thing down with a cotton cloth. When I select a barrel nut, I don't want it to be one that I can use on a plane. I want it to be one that has issues. The first two have been cut short, and one of them has a really chewed up end. This one I could probably use on a plane, so I don't want to take a chance of wasting one. And this one, there's nothing wrong with it, so I'm definitely not going to use that one. The final one is the one I'm going to use, and it has a little tiny nick. You can see it there where someone chipped it when they were taking it off or putting it on. So that's the one we're going to use. I use the same epoxy that I used to set the plug to set the barrel nut. It doesn't take much, just a dab along the inside of that hole. I didn't clean that barrel nut up because honestly, I don't care if it looks kind of worn. That's kind of the whole purpose of this. I then push it in until it's flush with the top where you would see it if it was on a plane. After that epoxy is set a while, I check it by rubbing it with my thumb to make sure it doesn't move. Plus, this kind of polishes it up a little bit. I then take Johnson's Paste Wax and liberally apply it all over the whole knob. Again, I'm not bashful with it here. Now I've got to wait about 20 minutes. Once the wax is dried, it's time to buff the entire knob out with a cotton cloth. This gives it a nice, silky smooth feel. When Stanley made the chip breaker screw, they cut the slot with a slitting saw, and a slitting saw has a slight radius to it, so it leaves that radius inside the slot. It's not flat. And I want these chip breaker screwdrivers to have that same or close to that same radius, as you can see in the one I made originally. And it fits in there perfect. So I'm going to cut a slight radius onto the end of this bit. And I'm going to do that at my sanding center. It doesn't take much, just a slight camber. Being sure not to let it get hot. And you can see how that bit fits in that screw perfect. The next thing I'm going to do is smooth out the end of it, so there's no chance of getting that screw marred up, taking it on and off. And for the finished product, you can see the one on the left matches the color of the one on the right almost perfectly. And there you have it. A chip breaker screwdriver made from leftover parts. The knob was a mahogany knob that I made that didn't have the right profile for the plane I was going to use it on. A leftover, less than perfect Stanley waist nut. An old brass fitting. A piece of oak and a scrap piece of 01 tool steel to finish it off. And it makes the perfect chip breaker screwdriver. So let's see how she does. The big handle on it should make it easier to grip. So when I put it in there, turn, no problem. And it, because it has the bigger grip on it, that you get a nice firm hold when you tighten it down. And there you have it. A useful tool to have around the shop. Thanks for watching.